We're going to take a look at merging multiple exposures together to create an HDR image, a high dynamic range image. What I have here is 3 photos that I shot in Seattle of a scene at Puget Sound at twilight. And there's a lot of dynamic range here, bright highlights, dark shadows, and it's hard to capture that entire range in one exposure without losing detail. First thing I'm going to do is take a look at this technique just using the Lightroom controls on a single photo and seeing how much detail I can pull out of a single exposure. In this case, the exposure where there is sky detail. So I right-click on the image and select Create Virtual Copy. And that creates a copy of the file within the Lightroom database. It doesn't take up extra space on disk. It's just an entry in the Lightroom catalog. But I can manipulate that without touching the original and do a compare-contrast type of thing. Now, I shot this at ISO 200 to get a decent shutter speed, and that's going to hurt me a little bit because this camera, even at ISO 200, doesn't do terribly well in the shadows. So I take this into Develop module and just run through some steps and see what I can do with it. Now, I've got good sky detail here, but I also want to pull up those shadows. So first of all, I'm going to open up the exposure a little bit and bring that histogram over to the right side. Just pull up some light tones overall on the image, about 3/4 of a stop, and that gets the histogram pretty well centered within the display. I'm also going to lower contrast to help keep the histogram within those boundaries a little bit more. Now I pull down highlights and then pull up shadows. It's easy to go too far with this and create something that looks a little bit too grungy, but I'm just seeing what I can do with this at this point. And I do want to make sure those shadows aren't too dark. Now I pull up the white clipping just to tweak that a little bit and darken down the shadows, the absolute blacks a little bit more. So tonally, the image is looking pretty good now. I've got detail in the dark areas and the light areas, and a little bit of clarity will help bring that out even more. I'm going to do some local adjustments, starting with a gradient filter. What I want to do is open up the exposure on the bottom half of the image just even a bit more, and doing it in a different way than pulling up shadows. Just do a simple exposure increase, which will look a little bit cleaner. And at the same time increase contrast because it was looking still a little bit flat down there. And then open up the shadows just a touch more. Now I'm next going to take a look at the local adjustment brush and do some more adjustments here. Zero out exposure and add some clarity. This is some local control on these rocks and waves. Use the scroll wheel to change the size of the brush and then start painting on, adding even more clarity. Trying to go for a little bit more of a punchy look on this. It's getting into that grunge area for high dynamic range imaging, but I like the look of clarity a little bit more than some of the grainier effects you see. And what wouldn't be complete without a little bit of a vignette. Now if I zoom in here to 100% and take a look in the shadow areas, what we see is that there is some noise buildup here. The combination of ISO 200 on an inherently noisy camera combined with pushing that exposure up so far really brings out that noise pattern. And even the 10 points of color noise reduction I put in normally isn't enough, so I need to go up to 20 on that. And my usual 10 points of luminance noise reduction, pretty effective in this case at smoothing that out. Realistically, this detail is pretty good. You can make an 8x10 print out of this, really no problem. And of course, one more step here, make sure to sharpen it. Hold the Option key. And up to about 25 points or so on this. And that brings out some of the detail. Adjust the radius, going up to about 1 pixel for the radius in this case. And I'm going to add some masking here. Oftentimes I'm using 10, in this case 25 is a little bit better fit, just to clean up some of those broad areas. So that is a single image adjusted with just the tone controls. Now, this is not true high dynamic range imaging, just an example to show what kind of detail can be pulled out of a single file. At this point, I'm ready to take a look at stacking these frames together, the 3 frames together, to create a high dynamic range image. Hold the Command key and click on all 3 of them to select the 3 images. If the developed settings aren't the same for the 3 images, it could create problems down the road as I stack these together and adjust them. So I'm going in and check lens corrections, and then check all for the synchronization. And now I've confirmed that all 3 of the images have the same settings for exposure, for lens corrections, sharpening, everything. And now click up to Photo, Edit in, Merge to HDR Pro in Photoshop. And this is where Photoshop can do some of the heavy lifting. It will automatically load the 3 images, stack them together in layers, and align those layers as best it can. This was shot handheld. It's always best to shoot from a tripod or some sort of stable surface, but handheld does work provided you don't move the camera around too much between exposures. All right, so now we're at the merge dialog, which shows the stacked result with a histogram and a few options. Right now the mode is set to 32-bit. And we're going to take a look at removing ghosts. This is often a problem when you've got objects moving around in the frame, in this case the moving water. The problem we run into is anomalies, artifacts in small details. See these multicolored areas in the waves. That's caused by the images not quite lining up, where a wave is at one position here and at one position on the other photo and another position on the third. Removing ghosts will eliminate that to a large extent. You can still see it there a little bit with those blue areas, but the effect has been reduced quite a bit. When you click on Remove Ghosts, Photoshop automatically tries to find the best frame from the stack to make this work. Oftentimes it chooses the darkest frame. And that's more often than not a good thing. If you notice the sky, there's a band that appears there as I switch between those other images. So to get good sky detail, in this case good highlight detail, I need to use that darkest exposure as my ghost anchor image. So that'll remove the artifacting issues to a pretty good extent and get the image ready to go. Now the histogram and the slider is simply a preview. It doesn't alter the image at all. This is just a visual guide for how much detail is in the image from the darks to the lights. So you can put the slider wherever you want. My habit is to push it all the way to the right to see all the highlight information I have. Now you also have some mode choices here. What we're going to do is save this as 32-bit. Because we can always go back to 16-bit later and do some tone mapping steps then. But you want to have a 32-bit image as your master image. So I click on OK, and Photoshop will create the file. So here is the stacked image, 32 bits per channel. From here, we want to save this. File, Save As. And my habit is to use the file numbers from the original files. You can save this as a Photoshop or a TIFF file, but you want to save it as a TIFF to make sure Lightroom can read it. And then I just go with my image file numbers here and make sure that I am indeed using the TIFF extension. And I'm ready to save. Now, you can choose 32-bit, 24-bit, or 16-bit. 16-bit is going to work just fine for this type of image because it doesn't have that many stops. 16-bit will hold several stops worth of information. You only need to go to 32-bit if you've got something like the surface of the sun and the bottom of a coal mine in the same photo. that kind of situation. But 16-bit will fit the information in this image pretty well, and it will create a smaller file size for us. Hard drives are cheap, but I still like to keep my files small if I can help it. So I'll turn on zip compression as well. And that'll save the image. And we're ready to take a look at it in Lightroom again. I'll leave this open for now, come back later and look at the tone mapping options. Lightroom has automatically added the image to the library for me, so I can take a look at it and immediately go into the Develop module. And I'm going to do roughly the same steps I did with the virtual copy that I made earlier. It has to be a little bit different because the exposure is just different for this image. So in this case, I need to pull the exposure down to bring that sky back. I'll lower the highlights a little bit more to bring in that highlight detail, and then lower contrast as well to bring the histogram in toward the center. And then start pushing up shadows. I have quite a lot of leeway here in adjusting these shadows and highlights because there is so much more information now. Pull the white clipping up a little bit, and then a little adjustment on the black clipping. And of course, a little bit of clarity. And now once again taking a look at the graduated filter. Adjust the exposure on that bottom area again. Pull that up by about a half a stop. And then take a look at the local adjustment brush, once again adding some clarity on those rocks like I did in the first version. And just paint that in. Now, of course, it wouldn't be complete without a vignette. And now take a look at finishing up noise reduction, sharpening, and the rest. I'm going to zero out sharpening for now and zoom in and take a look. Now straight away we see it's a lot cleaner. All that grain from the original is gone. There is some visual artifacting, and that's the result of the waves and the fact that those images just don't quite line up with that wave movement. HDR images really work best with totally static subjects. You see on the plant life on the rock there, it's sharp, it's clean, and it's got a lot of detail. And that's the real advantage of using this HDR technique, is you have detailed shadows and detailed highlights. And you don't need to mess around with noise reduction like you do on the single image. In this case, I'll only put in 5 points each for color and luminance noise reduction. And then go in and finishing up and add some sharpening. Roughly the same steps I did before for sharpening. I think those settings are the same. So if I hold Command and select the virtual copy, then press the the C key to compare these, I can take a look, click and zoom in on the two, and let everything load up. Now you really see the difference there, the amount of noise and detail, especially on those static rock areas. It's a lot cleaner, and that's the advantage you get with the HDR technique. I'll press the G key and then Shift Tab to come back to the grid view. Now take a look back in Photoshop at the tone mapping options. Image, mode, 16 bits per channel, and that brings up the tone mapping dialog. And there are some presets in here you can use. We're looking at the Photoshop CS6 presets on this, and CS5 is missing a few. But these are some nice starting points. Flat is a really good starting point to use, but you can play around with these however you want and see what works, and then adjust from there. Now the radius command adjusts how big those halos are at the high contrast edges. You can zero them out, or you can make them massive, or anything in between. And then the strength control just controls how visible those halos are. The detail slider will control the amount of grunge, or go into a Vaseline on the lens kind of look. And then shadows and highlights are somewhat similar to what you see in Lightroom. Similar idea of adjusting just those areas, the light areas or the dark areas of the image. And then vibrance and saturation work, as we've seen in Lightroom, very similar. You also have a tone curve you can adjust. I'll pull those existing points off and go to a linear curve and then play around with that. So you can go with a low contrast rendition. You can put in a traditional S curve and play around with that in all sorts of ways. You have a lot of control over how you tone map the image. There's really no wrong answer of how to do it. It's just something you need to spend time with and see what all the options can do and what you can pull out of the image. So this is one possible look. I'll click OK, and Photoshop will apply that toning and convert the image to 16-bit mode. I'll save that again so I can take it back into Lightroom and do any final work that I need to. In this case, you can save it as a Photoshop or a TIFF file. That's no problem. Lightroom will read both of those without any issue. I'm going to use the same numbering system here, except give it a little notation afterwards so I know that it's a toned image in this case. Save that. There's no options for the bit depth. I'll just go with the zip compression and save that. Close that, go back to Lightroom, and it shows up there as the first image. So here we have 3 variations on toning an image, 2 HDR and then one with just a single image. Hopefully this has been helpful.